Schizophrenics of Reddit, what were the first signs of your break from reality and how would you warn others for early detection? First thing was hearing voices of people I knew calling my name, when they couldn't possibly be there. Like, I would hear a family member or friend that lives 3 hours away by car. Then I started seeing objects, often while driving. Once on a lonely Nebraska night on Highway 2, a giant radio tower suddenly appeared in front of me in the road, and then dissipated when I drove through it. I also see silhouettes of people occasionally. Worst visual I have gotten was a very real-looking man trying to break into my house during the day, and it freaked me the F out. Happened twice. As someone who has schizophrenia, reading all the comments on this thread made me feel about 5,000 times less alone than usual. That being said, for me, it was thinking that all my friends were plotting against me. So much so that I started digging as hard as I could to find as much dirt on everyone as possible. Auditory hallucinations followed that pretty quickly. At its worst, I began misremembering important life events, only to find out years later that what I felt I so vividly remembered to be true, was actually not. But I guess that's psychosis for you. Meds, therapy, and a fiancé and friends who have your back all work wonders though. They don't judge me when things get rough. This sounds like a joke, but it's my real advice. If the shadow people acknowledge you, maybe see a doctor. Otherwise, just get some sleep. Edit. So like I have a million responses in my inbox, and it's f-king making me anxious. I won't be responding to any of them directly. 1. If you're concerned, see a doctor. I went to my GP first and he referred me to specialists. 2. The reason it's bad if they acknowledge you is because if you're just sleep deprived or mentally wonky, the shadow people tend to disappear when you focus on them, and don't appear to be up to any real funny business. 3. Shadow people. What are they? Humanoids of questionable origin and intent, also made of shadows. 4. For the one guy who was offended. Why? I'm describing symptoms. Illy though. 5. Finally, no matter their cause, the shadow people can't hurt you. If they become overwhelming, I stand by my above advice and suggest trying to sleep it off. Diagnosed schizoaffective bipolar here. Basically I have both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. It started when I was 5 years old. I would see dead people, feel the presence of ghosts, smell rust and metals, hear voices and thoughts of other people. As a teenager I thought I was a psychic. As an adult I started a job as a psychic medium. I legit thought I could predict the future. One day I just decided I'm f-king crazy and got a psych eval. Been on medication ever since and super grounded. My major triggers are fourth wall breaking video games and TV shows. The Truman Show is also horrifying for me. For myself it was messages from Nemesis the Greek goddess, was convinced I was her chosen one and to follow her. Also was constantly seeing shadow people / images constantly surrounding me and hearing my name called constantly, when not hearing Nemesis speaking to me. Went into therapy thinking I was bipolar, ended up finding out I was schizophrenic. Luckily on medication and doing better. Nowadays I struggle with the symptoms medicine can't help with like anxiety / depression / and all the other symptoms. The antipsychotics can't target alone. Honestly the stigma and having to explain to people why I'm jobless despite being a father / husband is the worst part. Feel like a failure many times a day due to being disabled. Hard to say where it started. I was very isolated at the time. I was just very confused I think. More than hallucinations I saw meaning behind everything and every coincidence. What that meaning was, didn't really know, eventually just decided it was my brain telling me I'm schizophrenic. Which I was very lucky to do. I went in for treatment of depression and was in the psych ward for 2 weeks, then probably a month after that I asked my doctor what was really wrong with me. It was pretty funny thinking back on it. I don't know how she didn't laugh in my face. Like bitch you've been talking to yourself and thought the TV was communicating things to you. You're probably going to get better answers from loved ones of schizophrenics, seeing as it's a coin toss whether or not we have any insight at all. I had a friend who started talking about a random new program he was working on Facebook. He was a cake decorator, so no one knew what he was talking about. Then he was randomly posting things like F everyone. He had very angry posts and then he would post a bunch of random numbers the next day. He kept saying he was working on the programs and these were the numbers he found. After a few months of this he disappeared on social media for a bit. Then he came back and said he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and was in treatment for it now. He also apologized for telling everyone to F off. Edit. Sorry I'm a bit vanilla flavored and don't like to cuss, even online. Lol. I don't mind if you all do though. Also, I've never had so many likes. Woo. I did lose close contact with him, but only because I live in another state. I did talk to him a few years back and he said he was taking medication for schizophrenia. He said he had thought the FBI had him working on program using the radio. He said he had pages and pages of number written down. He is still a FB friend though. He posts the most gorgeous cakes. He is a perfectionist. He has not been diagnosed, but I firmly believe my husband is schizophrenic. I never noticed the early signs at the time, but looking back he'd often get a really weird look on his face, and asked if I'd heard that. I always just thought he was being silly, so I'd laugh and say no. Then it began to happen with visuals too. He'd start to get really freaked out and I'd ask what was wrong and he'd say, "Did you see that?" And I'd say no and he'd try and play it off like he'd been joking. Eventually he'd start having complete breaks from reality, usually after the sun would go down. He'd act kind of off during the day and I knew what was coming that night. As for early detection, it's kind of hard to say. I guess if you're hearing or seeing things you know aren't there / others aren't seeing, that might be a good indicator. Careful worrying too much about auditory or visual hallucinations though. You can get both of these from something as simple as really bad sleep deprivation. I've been there, and while that's also pretty unhealthy, it's not as big of a concern as other issues. Also, just like your eyes try to find faces and images, I think sometimes you can hear your voice in random noise. My mother, father, and college roommate all had schizophrenia. In the case of both of my mother and roommate, their first signs early on was hearing their name being called and no one was there. More voices came for my mother, and eventually visuals. My roommate started feeling things on her, then delusions, and every possible kind of hallucination. I don't know what the first signs were for my father, but earlier delusions were that he thought he was on a game show and that he was being watched by the CIA. Edit: this was a quick post, so I'll add more here for clarity. First, my roommate was feeling touches and insects on her. The feeling of insects is probably common. She would also see spiders / flies. She had an unusually quick progression and would hallucinate demons, and sometimes flat out dissociate and go into something like a bad acid trip involving demons. My mother is currently medicated, but still hears demons talking to her. She is highly religious now. She also, apparently, hears the voice of one of her previous miscarriages, which she says is comforting. During the day she is very functional, but when she doesn't take medication she gets bad, and her symptoms worsen at night. Voices tell her what to do, i.e. don't drink wine. It used to be much worse with her. When I was a kid she told me she was talking to Jesus and a baby in the guest room, and Jesus said I would live forever. She would bring food to the attic because she thought someone was living in it. Once I went into her bathroom and saw she had written in pencil all over the counters and walls, like in a movie. She told me she was moving to Brazil to find treasure. She told me my father would turn into a winged demon, fly around, and beat her. He probably did beat her. My father was mostly delusional, and he thought he was being watched by the government, or aliens, or anything. This was in common with my roommate, who thought she was being watched by government / alien satellites, and would cover the windows with foil. My dad doesn't speak much about his symptoms, but has told me he remembers traveling through time to watch my mother get abused as a child, with the help of aliens. A lot of you wondered how I am. I'm okay. One risk factor was that my parents were pretty big cokeheads for a while, but at least my mother's symptoms started before all of that. As mentioned, she was also abused as a kid, so this could have contributed. I'm currently getting my PhD in genetics. I try not to think too much about what motivates me to study this topic other than an interest and talent in the field. One of my husband's good friends was never formally diagnosed, but we're almost certain he had some form of paranoid schizophrenia. He began to be very paranoid about anything when his symptoms first started. He believed a lot of conspiracy theories, like crazy ones about aliens invading and that a group of aliens from space were watching his every move. On one occasion, he and my husband had gone to a coffee shop together, and after about 45 minutes, the friend started to tense up and talked about how another man in the shop was a secret agent sent to spy on him. Instead of saying something like "Nah man, everything's fine, you're overreacting," my husband grabbed his friend's hand and said, "Man, that sounds terrifying. Let's get out of here and go to another shop instead where you'll feel more safe." I tear up a little bit just thinking about it. He was a completely normal guy until his symptoms started around age 23, with the exception of having some depression and probably being an alcoholic. He was an incredibly smart guy, but last year he killed himself. He had been largely abandoned by his friends for being too weird, and he didn't have much going for him when he had to move back home with his parents, but I'll always remember how kind and compassionate my husband was to him in those last months. His parents were also not very helpful and kind of brushed off his weird mannerisms, and so they didn't try to get him help. My first indication that he had become schizophrenic were his really cryptic Facebook posts that he'd make. They just seemed a little off. Nothing that would make you scream, "Oh my gosh, I think he's schizophrenic." They were just much different to things he'd normally post. Not schizophrenic but bipolar, which has led to psychosis. For me it started with derealization and depersonalization and escalated from there. I wasn't real and the world wasn't real led to seeing spiders all over the walls, and thinking that aliens were trying to kill me, and I had to kill them first. A friend was concerned and had the police do a welfare check, and I tried to stab the cop with a large knife, because I thought he was an alien. That shit is scary. Once they got me into the hospital and got me some treatment, I did much better. I'm actually off all my meds now, and doing pretty good as far as my delusions, but my life is also in a much better place. There is hope. My boyfriend was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. The first signs I believe were hearing or sensing beings in his room while he was going to sleep. The first ones I heard about as they happened was he would see something out of the corner of his eye, "There is a baboon in the lab." But then when he would turn to look directly he would realize it was a student. Later there were a lot of obsessive behaviors. Burning off freckles thinking they were cancerous, boiling a toothbrush to nothing if it fell on the counter. Making me repeat reassuring words repeatedly for hours. I eventually broke up with him, which prompted his schizophrenic break. Hundreds and hundreds of pages of emails detailing how he was going to rape and kill me. He believed he was sent from God, and me from the devil, and he had to destroy me. He left disgusting messages on my family's home phone about me, stalked me, and later found out he made a web page about me. Good news is years later he is doing well, though he still suffers a lot and is not happy. He has a fantastic job, wife he adores, great house, etc. I heard the disease described, I think by a schizophrenic on Reddit, as you are on a plane to Hawaii, and then you crash land in Siberia. And you realize that is where you live now. Forgive me for putting my condescending pants on, but it appears to me from your comments, that you are concerned about some of the symptoms you have been experiencing. If you are worried that you may be developing a mental disorder, please go talk to your regular doctor or a psychiatrist, about what you are going through. As you say, chances are that what you have been feeling could be nothing but worst case scenario and you do have a mental disorder. Early treatment has been shown to improve outcomes and delay could make things worse. Even just talking about things can sometimes help, and your doctor, a psychiatrist, or a psychologist are trained to handle these discussions. Reddit is, for the most part, a terrible place for medical advice and full of anecdotal evidence. Situational irony of this post aside, and seeking help from a trained and licensed professional is the best advice that I can give you. If this post was made out of pure curiosity, then please forgive my unsolicited lecture. Be well. Unusual beliefs. I didn't have hallucinations, but I had delusions. I had to cover up my webcam on my laptop, because I believed I was being spied on through it. That was probably the first sign. I then took the batteries out of my smoke detector, because I believed my smoke detectors had hidden microphones in it listening to me. I became convinced I was tracked online. Soon I started getting hidden messages in music and videos. Like I thought music videos made by celebrities were about me, and communicating to me messages. Like Bad Blood was a celebrity mad at me. A video by Katy Perry about birthdays made me think she was trying to tell me of an upcoming economic collapse. I believed they were hidden messages for my eyes only. Soon I believed people were out to get me. Out to kill me. People walking in the same direction as me on the street were following me. And I was hospitalized multiple times. I wanted it to stop. I wanted to die. I drank bleach, doused myself in gasoline, ect. There was no talking me out of my delusions. I believed them 100% as if they were a religious belief. They weren't logical either. Even when I would admit that I couldn't prove what I believed, I still believed it and thought everyone else was wrong. For 3 years I was delusional. I watched old game shows 12 hours a day, because I only newly made commercials and videos had hidden messages for me. Finally over this last summer it cleared up. I could finally see clearly that I was delusional, and only then did I accept my diagnosis as schizophrenic. Schizophrenia runs in my family, but I haven't been diagnosed, not that I go to the doctor, and the symptoms all stopped suddenly about half a year ago. But it started off with physical hallucinations. Small stuff like the feeling of spiders on me. But then it grew to feel like I'm covered in spiders. Then the feeling of a rope around my neck choking me. I started hearing voices whispering gibberish in my ear. These were inconvenient, but didn't really mess with my life. But, one morning I woke up because I heard a beep. The first thought in my head was, the F-King aliens put a device to record me, and spent about an hour looking for it before I realized I was being crazy. This happened a bit for a couple of years. Then suddenly it stopped. Not sure why, but I'm glad.